Welcome to the Art of Living Free series with Anthony Silard, brought to you by theartoflivingfree.org. Today we explore predicting the end of the pandemic. Is it better to be an optimist or a pessimist? Part 1.
I'm Anthony Silard, and welcome back to the Art of Living Free. We're going to talk today about predicting the end of the pandemic. Is it better to be an optimist or a pessimist? Now, this is a big issue right now. This is the million-dollar question going through most of our minds every single day. You know, I can't speak for you, but I wake up thinking about it. Like, when is this going to end? That's the question we ask over and over again to ourselves. That's why many of us check the news 10, 15, 50 times every single day, glued to our phones, checking the latest thing about a vaccine or about the curve or about the number of cases or fatalities. So it's on our mind all the time, but there's one very important distinction. Some of us have an optimistic view where we think, you know what, this may end in a few months. There's a lot of progress with vaccines. Certainly lately there's been a lot of progress reported, and maybe there's going to be a vaccine by December. Right? Others of us think about how my life has changed, and there's other, in the Art of Living Free, we have other episodes on post-traumatic growth, on how many of us focus on the positive, like how we can grow from trauma that we're experiencing during this pandemic. We think about how our relationships are changing. We have more time for our children, our families. Some kids are even like, this is great, my parents are playing board games with me. That's never happened before. You know, so there's so many ways that actually we can see our life priorities, our philosophy of life changing in positive ways, appreciating life, appreciating nature more. So the optimists wax eternal on all the different positive things that can come out of this pandemic. Well, the pessimists, on the other hand, of course, they see it very differently. So they say, you know, this is the new normal. It's never going to go back to what it was like before. We're never going to have social connection again. In fact, if you can believe this, a New York Times survey of over 500 epidemiologists, where they asked them a number of questions about how long do they think certain things will last that have happened during this pandemic, such as social distancing. If you can believe this, 6% of epidemiologists said that they believe we will never hug or shake hands again. Right? Talk about very severe pessimism. It's out there, whether you're an epidemiologist or professional, whether you're a college student or you're in high school or you're a stay-at-home mom or dad. All of us, our views are shaped by, are we optimistic or pessimistic related to this pandemic? Are we going to flatten the curve, or is the curve going to flatten us? Right? That's what's on our minds all the time. Okay, so is it better to be optimistic or pessimistic? Who can say? Well, it turns out actually that someone can say, because there's been a study that was done recently, and this is by David de Meza of London School of Economics and Chris Dawson of the University of Bath, both in the UK. And what they did was they looked at the British Household Panel Survey of over 1,600 people, where they asked these folks the same questions between 1991 and 2009. Now, two of the questions in particular are the ones that we're going to focus on here. First question was, how do you think you will be financially a year from now? Right? And then the second question, would you say that you're better off, worse off, or the same financially than you were a year ago? So de Meza and Dawson, what they did was, they then looked at over the 18 years of the survey, longitudinally, they looked at what did people think about how they would be financially a year later versus a year later? Were they actually what they predicted? Were they better off? Were they worse off? Or were they the same? Right? And the idea was that this way they could compare people who are optimistic, realistic, or pessimistic. Right? So the people that were unrealistically optimistic would say, oh, I'm going to be making much more money next year. But guess what? They didn't. They weren't. The people who were unrealistically pessimistic said, well, I'm probably going to be earning this amount next year, and they actually were earning more. So they had this kind of elation later that they were pessimistic, and then they had this surprise. They're doing better than they thought. Right? And then the third group was actually really good at forecasting their future financial situation, and they predicted it very well. Well, which of these groups do you think is the happiest? Well, it may not come as a surprise to you that the happiest group of these three, the optimists, pessimists, or realists, are the realists. The realists actually are able to forecast their future, and I would say one of the reasons that I think, this is conjecture, but what I think the reason that they are happiest is because they develop trust with themselves. So actually, if you look at the word confidence, if you take the Latin behind the word, the etymology, confidence, it comes from con, which is with, and fidere, which is trust. Confidence means trust with. So self-confidence means trust with self. So if you're a realist, you develop this self-confidence, you develop this trust with self. Hey, I have an idea about what my future will look like, and guess what? That's what happens. Okay, yeah, I guess I know how to do this, right? You become more self-confident. Whereas the optimists and the pessimists, they don't develop as much trust with self because they realize that what they predicted is not what happened. So for the first finding here from this study, which is really important when we think about predicting the end of the pandemic, is that if you can be a realist, that's the best way to be. So if you can accurately forecast the end of the pandemic, then you're in the best spot whatsoever. And by the way, can you please tell me? Because I'm dying to know, right? So the reality though, speaking of being a realist, right? I'm going to be a realist now. The reality from this realist is that most of us cannot predict 100% what's going to happen in the future. None of us have a crystal ball. So the real story is that most of us, based on our personalities, based on our dispositions, based on the parents and coaches and librarians and teachers that we observed and learned from through what Albert Bandura at Stanford called social learning or social cognition. Like we learn from others, we observe them. Based on that, we've inherited either a sort of a optimistic view of the world or a pessimistic view of the world. And so most of us, we're not going to hit that forecast perfectly. We're going to be above or below based on our predisposition towards optimism or pessimism. All right, so if you're going to be an optimist or pessimist, which one is better? Let's take a look at that study by de Meza and Dawson in the UK. So think about it. If you're unrealistically optimistic, then you're going to go through life. You remember the Carter family about keep on the sunny side of life, right? You're going to be on the sunny side. You see things positively, right? But you're going to end up being somewhat disappointed later, right? When your optimistic view of what's going to happen is above or it's inflated beyond what actually does transpire, right? Now, let's consider if you're a pessimist. If you're a pessimist, you're actually going to feel some elation or some surprise, enthusiasm later when, hey, guess what? I'm doing better than I thought I would do, right? Because you have a deflated view of what will happen, and then the actual events that happen are better than you predicted, okay? So a lot of us would go, well, it sounds better to be pessimistic because if we're pessimistic, then we're going to have this nice surprise that things are better than we thought. Well, the problem is that when you're a pessimist, most of the time what you're doing is envisioning these kind of doom scenarios, right? Such as those 6% of epidemiologists that say, we'll never shake hands or hug again, right? So if you have that view, then most of the time you're there going, life is horrible, everything is going to fall apart, it'll never be the way it was, our way of life is gone. And then there's this moment of elation that maybe lasts for a week. Daniel Gilbert talks about that, does research on that, the social psychologist, about how when we project our happiness in the future, we're always off. We think we're going to be happier than we are when we get what we want. It's like if you win the lottery, oh, I'm going to be so happy when the lottery. People win the lottery. Within weeks, they're back to the same level of happiness as before winning the lottery, right? So, or someone who becomes disfigured and disabled. We think if that happens to me, I'm going to be so miserable the rest of my life. Well, actually, after a number of months, people tend to find something beautiful in that state and in their lives, and their happiness comes back also to what it was. So, in other words, predicting how we'll be in the future is not a good basis for making our decisions today. So then it comes down to, do you want to spend most of your days feeling positive about what's going to happen later, or do you want to spend them envisioning doom and gloom and feeling miserable about what's going to happen later? Well, according to the study by DeMessa and Dawson, optimists and pessimists both experienced less well-being than the realists. So the realists were the ones that were the happiest, who accurately predicted their future. Now, by the way, one caveat, this was based on finances and predicting one's financial situation. That's different than predicting when a public health crisis, the biggest health crisis in our lifetimes, is going to end. We don't have any data that says how that relates to optimism and pessimism. So we're projecting here, extrapolating. Just keep that in mind. But there's a very useful lesson nonetheless, right? Now, if we go back to the study, we see that the optimists and pessimists were both less happy than the realists. But get this, the pessimists experienced about 38% more psychological distress than the realists. The optimists experienced about 11% more psychological distress. In other words, if you're a pessimist, you're going to experience, according to this study, 3.5 times more psychological distress than if you're an optimist. So it sounds to me, if we for our own well-being, for our happiness, that being optimistic may be a good idea.
Life offers us many challenges, and the artoflivingfree.org offers new ways of thinking so we can see these challenges from a new angle and overcome them. Whether it's Anthony Silard's free blog, video or podcast series, his book, Screened In: The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age, or personalized courses, the artoflivingfree.org will help you refine your life vision and then transform it into action. Find out more at theartoflivingfree.org.